Hey, good morning, everyone. In U.S. History 1, I'm going to do hopefully a fairly modest, quick review of Chapter 7 in your textbook, American Yelp, the Early Republic. The book starts off with sort of the end point of the election of 1800, where Thomas Jefferson finally is declared the winner of the election. He is the Republican Democrat. The Federalist is John Adams. He loses, and it's sometimes called the Revolution of 1800. Why? Because it's really the first truly contested party election in American history, and a lot of people are concerned would transition of power be done peacefully, and that's why it was a revolution. Those who held power gave it up fairly amicably, if you will, for lack of a better way of saying it, while others took control. Thomas Jefferson, and it was done peacefully and with grace and a great deal of dignity. And Thomas Jefferson really made an effort to unite the country after that very divisive campaign. When he comes into office. But the chapter starts off with sort of that introduction that this is where we're closing up. Jefferson, the Republican Democrat, the party of less government, of small government, of less commercial interest than Hamilton envisioned, came into power. They're more aligned with the concepts of the Fresh Revolution, much more about spreading democracy in a broader fashion. Many of us, especially students at, I'm sure at the Mount, I know when I was a student at community college, and still has a philosophical vision that I have today, I think many people should be allowed, or almost all people should be allowed. I don't think my 15-year-old should be allowed to vote, but you get the idea that Thomas Jefferson's vision was a much more democratic society, much more participation in civic life, and there was a responsibility to do so, a broadened base of participation. He gets elected. The Federalists, not all of them, but most of them had a view that it should be the educated, wealthy, aristocratic members of society that really run the society for the benefit of all, but they're the ones that really should have the reins of power. It shouldn't be civic broad based inclusion. It should be much more narrow to the propertied interest in those that have a stronger stake in society. And we see the evolution in this chapter of that by certainly by the mid 1800s. I don't believe any state still required any property ownership to participate in voting. Any white male of age could vote coming to the mid century of the 1800s. And that's an interesting phenomenon. It becomes much more democratized and less based upon federalist views of aristocratic control. We still have that tension sometimes in American history today. Should really the educated, I hate to say elite because elite suggests some puts a chip on most people should right away. We don't want the elite running anything, but should it be the people that are really running the industries of our society, running the educational institutions, running um, the civic sort of foundations of our nation? Shouldn't they really be running the nation for the best interest of those who are less educated, less vested, less knowledgeable about what's going on? That tension still remains to this day, but we're more democratic today than we ever have been. But Jefferson was that turning point that he wanted to really create the power of citizenship in every white adult male. Now, the chapter does start off right away with the examination of enslaved people, a very sad part of our history, and it was huge. Um, and the challenge to slavery was starting to build up. There was more of a movement, especially as slavery dies in the Northeast. Um, there becomes an anti-slavery movement, often promoted or undergirdled, if you will, by the women's groups. Did significant amounts to fight for the abolition of slavery in our society. But that tension's there. It's a huge part of the Southern economy. It does also fuel part of the Northeast economy. So it's not a universal goal to end slavery, but that tension's there. And the book does a nice yet sad exploration of the views about slavery and about racism. And it was huge. And one of the things that happened was there was a potential slave revolt, and they mentions the person's name, and I certainly want to do it. I always know it as Gabriel's uprising, but the gentleman's name, well, I guess they just call him Gabriel from Virginia. He and many others, I think it was over a thousand men, slaves, planned this revolt, and basically it got leaked and fettered out, and it never happened. But it really put a chilling effect on those states and regions that had high numbers of African slaves, because all of a sudden it became apparent that these people were thoughtful, creative, cunning, and they might well revolt. So what do? You do even greater oppression. So slavery takes on an evolution. It's heinous enough, it's harmful enough to anybody's soul and psyche and history, but it really starts cramping down as a result of fears of uprising and of this sort of push for liberty and equality in African slaves. Really, instead of gaining it, it acts in another fashion, and acts polar opposite, and slavery becomes much more brutalized. And so Gabriel and others become killed. I think they killed, how many people in total, I don't know. 25 others were killed. Many others were brutally punished as a result of the potential uprising that never occurred. And what's the underpinning of that? Is, well, there's a recognition that these human beings have maybe the same goals and aspirations of the white European settlers in the colonies, well, no longer colonies, but states. And it's unsettling to slave owners to think that these people are going to start wanting the same things that they have. And one of the interesting things is freed slaves really can't exist in the South, because Southern plantation owners and owners of slaves don't want free African Americans engaging in business and industry, enjoying freedom and civic life. And African slaves that can witness that will get ideas, for lack of a better way of saying it. So if you were a freed slave, you had to get out of the South. Really starting to create a huge tension in our country. It should have been a tension from day one, but it's becomes more of a fermentation process is really taking place. And the other is the Haitian Revolution, which lasts from 1791 to 1804. Basically, African slaves in the island of Haiti revolt, and successfully revolt. They basically whipped the French. The French were also suffering from severe um, diseases at the time. I'm not sure which fever of it was at the time, but they couldn't suppress the slave revolt. Haiti basically becomes a free nation of former African slaves. And that is close to home. And the news reaches Virginia, and it also reaches African slaves. Not all slaves are illiterate. They hear the news from oral histories. People tell them the stories of what happens in Haiti, that freedom is born there for Africans. But some Africans are literate, and the word spreads, and the news is constantly haunting, states like Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia about the potential for slave revolt. And these concerns really causes slavery to become more brutalized and much more restrictive as a result of these things that are happening worldwide. Um, the book goes into a very sad part of our history about what many of our forefathers believed about Africans in terms of genetic superiority versus inferiority. And we know there's this really sad history. And I'm surprised the book spent so much time on it, but it is fascinating. There was a gentleman by the name of Henry Moss who had some kind of skin disorder where his pigmentation started to change. And Henry Moss was pretty educated and articulate. And they said, well, because he's becoming civilized in white society, his skin color is changing by nature, because basically taking the genetic defect of being African and turning him into a white. Really sad commentary. Many people didn't believe it. This is the age of enlightenment, where people started recognizing that all humanity is equal, maybe, and that all should have the same opportunities to strive for sort of independent thought and government of their choice. That was a tension against slavery. Others felt that, including Thomas Jefferson, sadly. Thomas Jefferson fought and did so many great things, but one of the sad things he did was he believed African Americans actually probably had a separate God, were a separate species completely inferior to the white race. He was definitely a racist. And many other men and women during that era were also racist. And these tensions start to develop during this era, and later on, what some people who wanted to end slavery didn't necessarily want to have African Americans in their community. And there was a new thing called the recolonization movement. Let's send them back to Africa. And that movement was actually sponsored by some freed African Americans as well. They felt they could never become part of the landscape of civic life in white America, because they would never be accepted and it would never be fair play. Those tensions remained right after the Civil War. Some people did try to re-immigrate, for lack of, but there's sometimes 2 or 3 generations later, they don't know that country as their home. They know America as their home. And the thought of being repatriated to a look to them now as a foreign nation. They don't speak the language anymore, and they're not bonded to people there anymore in terms of relationships. Very, very challenging. But there's a lot of different layers of views about African Americans, those that had slave interests, those that wanted to free them and give them great equality, guys like William Garrison. There's other characters like that, but they're starting to get more and more prevalent during this period of time. So the Enlightenment period, that there was a common humanity, that there's possibility of societal progress, making oneself better through education and self-improvement was big, and that runs in direct opposition to the concepts of slavery. And the book talks about the different theories of racism that existed at the time, really worldwide, that people in power want to justify why they're there and why they can dominate and take advantage of those who are not in power. They try to distinguish it based upon the color of one's skin and ethnicity and race, and it was the history's been there for a long time, and it was really sad in our country's history, and it still exists today. There's remnants of it today. We still are dealing with it in the media, in events that occur daily. Racial intolerance and ignorance, pretty significant. But that's the bad part of Jefferson, and it's huge. It's hard not to not be disgusted by it. But Jefferson also had some great qualities too. It's ironic that Jefferson was so anti-equality for African Americans, but he clearly had an affair with Sally Hemings. We know that through DNA testing now, that he did have several offspring with his slave, and yet he proclaims inferiority of the race. Really sad. But anyways, Jeffersonian republicanism, most people, this is where they get excited and think the guy's fantastic. Those of us especially that have common views of that, all people are equal in terms of participating in democracy. He certainly broadened that appeal, and it represented a victory for non-elite white Americans in their bid to assume direct control of the government. He wanted the government directly ruled by the people. White men should rule it directly, and it shouldn't have any property interest. And that would lead to a true democracy and a beautiful thing. Others, the Federalists, thought that was going to lead to chaos and mob rule. And what they called him was, the Republicans had peacefully declared the scribe, meaning a writer, of national independence, the philosopher patriot who had battled tyranny with his pen and not with the sword or the gun. And this is the excitement over his presidency. And his presidency was very, very popular during the 8 years he served, with one major exception, we'll get to in a minute. Women during this era, and they put it right in this section of the book. I thought they should have separated about women, but women were actually given a great deal of civic responsibility. They weren't allowed to vote, of course. They didn't get the right to suffrage, but they were viewed as being an extension of the family that played an important role in engaging their children and their households in civic knowledge and responsibility. And they actually coined a phrase, historians coined a phrase for it. It's called Republican motherhood. Described the early American belief that women were essential in nurturing the principles of liberty and citizenry in their children. And that was a huge aspect of it. And it was certainly a strong belief that women played a very important role in civic life. But ironically, they wouldn't be given the right to vote. There was a push for that. It was Abigail Adams, for example, wrote John Adams many letters during the drafting of the Constitution about remembering the women, so to speak, and their contribution to the revolution, that they should have a role in civic life more than just doing all the work and not getting any of the say. But there's an argument there is some say there if they're given the responsibility of engaging in sort of the civic promotion of what it is to be an American citizen. Jefferson as president, he's I think a real character in a way. He actually wants small government. He doesn't want government to be involved in everyday people's lives. People should just be left alone. He didn't believe there should be a lot of taxes. His goal was to not have any taxation during his presidency, and he came very close to that. And he also didn't like a standing military. He thought that was intimidating to the citizenry, and also could lead to tyranny of those who were in charge because they controlled the military. So the military was tiny during this period of time. So was his Navy. He didn't want to spend any money, his own money. He spent prolifically, and he was in huge debt when he died. He wasn't afraid, but when it comes to taxpayers' money, it should be very de minimis, very low taxes. People should be largely left alone. Um, and that was a very, very popular view in his outlook. The one major exception, it's a fun story, is the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of our nation overnight. Spain had control of the Louisiana territory, which is not just Louisiana; it goes all the way through the whole central section of the country. That's why I always find it funny when I call it the Louisiana Purchase. I always picture in my mind just Louisiana. It's not. It doubles the size of our country. It's a whole central swath of our nation is at stake here. And initially, it went back and forth between French, Spain, but then back to French again. And Napoleon wanted to expand and get a new foothold back into the New World. And so he owns that property, and he was going to use Haiti as sort of a launching pad to further his nation's interest, French nation's interest in the New World. Unfortunately, because of the loss of Haiti and because he's having a difficult time on the European continent, he needs to come up with some cash. And what does he do? He offers to sell it to the United States at an unbelievable, I believe it was $15 million. I think in today's dollars comes out around $250 million. Still a freaking unbelievable bargain to double the size of our nation. And it was unconstitutional. There's no mechanism in the Constitution allowed for it. You'd have to create a constitutional amendment to do it. And Jefferson realized that. So did Congress. But Jefferson actually came up with, I think it's one of my favorite quotes. I know it's one of my favorite quotes, but I got to see what it says right in the book. Yeah, he actually talked to his cabinet members regarding the constitutionality, but the book doesn't come to the conclusion. But I can tell you, as someone who's interested in that area of constitutional history, it was unconstitutional. He had no right to do it, nor did Congress have a right to do it. It was not allowed under the United States Constitution to do such an act. But listen to what he said. He said, he believed he was obligated to operate outside the strict limitations of the Constitution if the good of the nation was at stake, and his ultimate responsibility was to the American people. He should be able to throw himself onto the justice of the country if he should be found wrong to have done it. The Louisiana Purchase was hugely popular. Initially, a lot of the Federalists were going to jump all over this, Thomas Jefferson purchasing the Louisiana Purchase, but it was kind of like, he hit a home run, he hit a grand slam in the bottom of the ninth inning. He won the game for the Republican Democrats. It's almost lights out for the Federalists after this point. Jefferson scores this huge success as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. It gets the French out of the country, but not only gives us control of the Mississippi River, which is a huge trading route for us down through the Ohio River Valley all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a win-win for the nation. Even though it was unconstitutional, it's still hugely popular. It's like kind of anytime anybody breaks a rule. If everyone likes what the outcome is, we'll just ignore it for now. Same with those of you who take, well, I guess we'll get into it a little bit in this course because we do go through the Civil War. Abe Lincoln is one of the most popular presidents in our history. Did he violate the Constitution? Several times. And the Supreme Court even said so after his death and after the Civil War was over, but the cases finally came to fruition and they said he did violate the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson does it here for the good of the country, and all of us in history, I think, support that. It really expanded our control of the continent as we know it, nor the what we think of as the parameters of our country are starting to really take a shape as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. And one thing the book didn't really talk about, not too long after that, maybe it's in the next chapter, the Lewis Clark expedition becomes a very popular, almost a nationalistic story that unfolds in the newspapers regularly. Stories come back about the Lewis and Clark expedition, and that's what it was for, was to explore what the heck we buy with the Louisiana Purchase. People weren't even quite sure, including Thomas Jefferson and the cabinet. What did we really buy? In terms of a landmass, and it turned out to be a gigantic, and we know that. And then, unfortunately, during this period of time, the French and the British are still at war. Our military, our Navy, and our merchants are constantly being harassed by both the French and the English, but mostly the English, and they're doing this thing called impressment. It's the one thing the Jay Treaty didn't resolve. It's going to create huge tensions between us and Britain, but also the French. So what does Thomas Jefferson do? He doesn't want to get entangled in any kind of more between the French and the Spanish and the English. We just want to stay out. So he puts a universal embargo on all of them. We're not going to do any trade with any of you guys. doesn't do anything to the French, doesn't do anything to the English or the Spanish, doesn't hurt them at all. They don't even blink an eye. What does it do? It nearly crushes the American economy, almost causes a depression. It's probably the darkest piece of history besides slavery that Thomas Jefferson has his name attached to was the embargo, and it was repealed right after his presidency was over. If it wasn't for that, uh, and one other thing with Aaron Burr, declaring Aaron Burr guilty before the Congress, which was he was out of control going after Aaron Burr, but that's not even in this chapter. Hopefully, we'll deal with it later on. But Aaron Burr thinks that the West wants to break away and at least conceivably has this having creating a mini revolution and maybe taking over Texas or maybe taking over a Western region, creating a new nation within the country. His plot gets kind of spoiled, but the evidence against him is very, very weak. John Marshall on the Supreme Court sits as the presiding judge at the trial, which we would never have today, but back in the day, they would not only be on the Supreme Court, but they would be circuit judges and go hear the case. And there was very little evidence that they could support that Aaron Burr did anything illegal. And of course, he's acquitted. He's found not guilty in 2 separate trials. But Thomas Jefferson's furious, and he basically declares to the world and in front of Congress that Aaron Burr is guilty as hell. And it's unheard of for a president to do that. To me, that's a black mark against Thomas Jefferson. It should be about due process, and you have your right to trial. Presidents and people like that shouldn't go out declaring guilt of other people. That's for courts to do or not do. But anyways, the Embargo Act is one of the dark parts of. And he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to put pressure on Great Britain and France. Leave us alone. Thousands of American sailors were removed from merchant ships, not so much military because we didn't have too many military ships at the time, merchant ships and impressed, meaning they had to go and serve in the British Navy as a result of that. That tension was existing back in the 1790s when we created the Trade Treaty, but that's the one thing we didn't resolve in the Trade Treaty was impressment. It continues, and arguably it leads to the War of 1812, in part is the impressment process. But boy, that embargo did not work at all. It was very detrimental, nearly killed the American economy completely. And Jefferson even said after his presidency was over, "But if you just let it continue a little while longer, it would have went great." I'm not buying it. Neither did. So we know that as a result of Jefferson's success during this period of time, in terms of the Louisiana Purchase, in terms of really the country doing fairly well, other than an embargo, it's not quite going into the golden era, but it's close. Some people do call it a golden era during his time. And what does it further do? It gets the Republican Democrats more power, and it makes the Federalists become weaker and weaker and weaker. In fact, the Federalists are pretty much done now. And the next election is going to be Madison. He's a Jeffersonian Republican Democrat, and then Monroe after him. They're all in the same boat. There's no more success. The only last success or I would say roots of power that rest within the Federalist realm is going to be John Marshall on the United States Supreme Court, who survives on that court into the 1830s. But here's what's interesting. By 1824, we know Jefferson's out in 1808. There's a custom that develops in our country's history is serving 2 terms and no more. He's done in 1828, but what's interesting in the book, it says by 1824, only 3 states still had rules about how much property somebody had to own in order to vote. So we become very, very democratic during that early era of the post-Revolutionary War. The last one to run as a Federalist was somebody named Rufus King, and he lost to Monroe in 1816. After that, we can call the Federalists a dead deal. What happens later is the Republican Democrats the only party, and then like any other party that gets a little bit too comprehensive, there's sects within it, and they break off, and that's going to be the first real distinguished, or what we call distinctly the Democrats, which exists to this day, and that's because of Andrew Jackson having a different view of some of the principles of how governance should rest, and that comes up later. It's not in this chapter. But Native American power in the United States, we know Native Americans. They tried it under Detroit. It's going to happen again under Tecumseh. Tecumseh and his brother have these visions of, hey, now they got the whole central part of the country too. What about our lands? What about our people? Let's unite as what we call pan Native Americans, meaning not just the Senecas or the I can never name all the groups, but most of them are in the central part of the Ohio River Valley. They include such thing as the Shawnee, the Miami, the Iroquois, the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, the Huron, the Mingo, the Chickamauga, and other indigenous people. They're obviously one time warring with each other sometimes, but Tecumseh recognizes that, hey, you know, let's get together here. Whatever our differences are, they're nothing like our differences with these white people, basically taking away our land and trying to inculcate their specific understanding of the world onto us. So we don't want their religion. We don't want their way of life. It's us or them, and we have to reunite, and we have to be united as one. And Tecumseh gives us a great deal of problems for many, many years. Really, the ending of the Native American uprisings in a big way ends with Tecumseh and his brother, and that happens basically because of the War of 1812. Because the British, well, I'll get to that in a minute, but the War of 1812 ends it. But in short, there was a resurgence of Native American vision and hope of either stopping or reversing some of the land taking and domination of Western civilization into the Americas. And the last of these Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh's brother, and I never can pronounce his name, who was basically a spiritual leader, they die with the War of 1812. Their power basically ends along the Great Lake regions and down to the Ohio River Valley, and they fight hard and they win some major battles, but in the tide was just too strong against them, and they couldn't stay unified. In fact, some of the unifications that they start kind of break down, and like anything else, you know, some of the Native American groups actually ally with basically the American forces to help defeat the what we call the pan-native alliances. Finally, they break down. Yeah, it says men like Tecumseh and Pontiac left a legacy of pan-Indian unity that was not soon forgotten. And to this day, different groups that historically may have not been allied often try to come together and pass legislation or promote their interests as Native American peoples, and not so much concerned about their identity as different Cherokee, the Potomac, whatever different Indian groups there are, they are more unified in recognizing there's power and unity, and there's also weakness and division. And so that comes up. So the War of 1812, one of my favorite little topics. We know that the Jay Treaty was really just a forestalling of our tensions with Great Britain. We had a lot of them. They were doing some terrible impressment of our military navy. Really merchant marines. They weren't navy. They were private. Some of them were legit though, meaning that the British Navy, which is the most powerful arm of their military branches, they were losing sailors to the merchant interests in the United States because the pay would be much better. So they basically say, hey, screw this Navy stuff. Why be in a military ship? I'm going to go serve in one of these private admiralty wings of some company and make more money. And so the British were upset by that. And so they would seize American ships at sea, and they would try to determine that we think you're a British basically subject. And once you're a British citizen, in their view, you're always a British citizen. And if you're supposed to be serving in the Royal Navy, it's time to come back. We know that their reach went way beyond those who had basically avoided service in the British Navy, and they were impressing American citizens, and it was really, really creating a war talk. And there was one group. Now that here's what's interesting: we're all now pretty much the core of the United States is Republican Democratic, but there's a group within them called the War Hawks, and you probably hear that term to this day when there's talk of maybe tensions with other countries, other regions of the world. There'll be people whipping up in interest and let's just go kick some butt. Let's go win. I mean, we're being either insulted or our rights are being trampled upon or our financial or property interests are being hurt. And that's where the name comes from during this era. Guys like Henry Clay and others. I don't know if they mentioned them in the book, some of the other people at the time that were upset with the way in which the British Navy was doing it. But it goes beyond that. There was also, some of it's true, some of it's not so true, that we still had what? We still had the British in Canada, and there were still British outposts in the far west, and there's arguments that they were funneling funds and money and antagonism to the Native Americans to fight against the United States. Some of that was true, but some of that was definitely hyperbole. It wasn't as accurate as what might sound. So who was to blame for the Western farmers and pioneers that were going out west? for all the tensions with the Indians? Well, it wasn't just the Indians that were at fault, or the Native Americans. It was the British. The British were fueling them financially, armament, and supporting them in all kinds of fashions to undermine those Western pioneers. And so this undercurrent of anger, impressment by the British. Also, there was some interest in gaining Canadian lands, let's be honest. And that view, those things, viewing that they were supporting the Native American attacks, that they were supporting the impressment of American sailors, in that they were holding Canadian lands that we really liked along the Great Lakes, were all part of the impetus to ultimately go to war. About 30% on American ships were British, but of those 30%, they took more. Some 6,000 Americans between 1803 and 1812 suffered the fate of impressment. It's pretty significant. And we know the embargo, which didn't hurt Great Britain or the Europeans at all. Listen what it did to us. It drove exports down from $108 million in 1807 to 22 million. It's dropped down 80%. 80% of our exports are dropped down. It was really, really dramatic. So this tension, because of our economic pain, because of the embargo, who's at fault? Great Britain's at fault. Great Britain at fault. More and more tensions are going up. And the war hawks during this period, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun's going to play a big role right into our Civil War, believe it or not, but he was back there in 1812 asking for war to go against Great Britain. And finally, they did June 1st, 1812, that if we're going to basically declare war, it goes in 3 stages. Think of it as this. Basically, it's stalemate for quite a while. And much of the battle is fought, well, it's fought in the Atlantic, but it's also fought along the Great Lakes. Initially, we have some success, and they push us back, and we actually lose some ground in Michigan. The war is not going great for us. It's not going for Great Britain well either, because they're really fighting a European war on the European continent, so they can't put their full effort behind it, almost like the Revolutionary War. So it's kind of going at a stalemate until one great thing happens, and the great thing is that the European war ends. Napoleon's defeated. Great Britain's freed up to fight the war a little bit more successfully. And we know what happens. One of the great, I don't know if it's a great thing, but we were basically, it looked really bad. They invaded Maryland and Washington D.C. and they burned down the White House. A lot of people don't know that we had a second invasion, and one of the commanders of the Navy ship, it's not in this book, but I've read it in many other narratives of this War of 1812. They mocked James Madison, who was president at the time, and they mocked him by wearing some of his clothes and some of his wife's clothes, Dolly Madison. And they said, "Oh, Jimmy, thank you for the fine clothes and fine wines in the White House." And they proceeded to burn it down. Things did not go well for that period of time. And things were looking bad. And they brought in troops, we know, into Louisiana. And this is the irony of it all. That third tier war is now down in the Louisiana region of the New Orleans. And the Battle of New Orleans is going to make one person a hero in 1850, and we know that's Andrew Jackson. He is going to whip butt, no question about it. They lose thousands of soldiers, the Great Britain does. And how many do we lose? Roughly 72, under 100 men. Andrew Jackson becomes this great war hero as a result. The irony of it is, because the war was fought for so long and it was so expensive for both sides, everyone was war weary. We already signed a treaty in Ghent over in Europe, and that was signed on December 24th, 1814. And so the Battle of New Orleans, which is fought on, what's the specific date? January of 1815, basically a month later, we already had peace. Why is that important? Because Andrew Jackson is made a war hero as a result of that, which is great. Is a great pathway to political power, and he really did a great job there. But the job didn't need to be done because the war was already over. Why do we keep fighting then? Well, you got to look at the era. We didn't know about things until sometimes months later because we didn't have cell phones and emails and text messages. What did we have? We had snail mail delivered on ships, and sometimes took months to get back to us. So we know that happens. And one of the things the book I thought could have done a more interesting, this tension between states' rights and regional interest versus the national interest is going to plague us through the Civil War, maybe even beyond. And one of the things that happened was something called the Hartford Convention. It happened right in Hartford, Connecticut, down the road from me here, and was an interesting group. Last of some of the Federalists that were still around felt there was a regional difference between these Western expansionists, between Southern interests. Um, in between those in the Northeast. And the Northeast were very, very unhappy with, I don't know why they'd be unhappy, they were unhappy with the Louisiana Purchase. They were unhappy with the Republican Democrats running the nation. They didn't like Southern slaveholders, and they wanted to remove their 3/5 compromise from the United States Constitution, giving them more power in the Congress because African American slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of the census. And so they met down in Hartford to talk about changing the Constitution and basically getting their regional interests more say. Unfortunately, they looked like they wanted to be revolutionary and go back to the king and to a monarchy and to be aristocratic, and it really backfired. And they looked bad as a result of the Hartford Convention. But we're going to have others related to Southern succession movements, even in this era. And it's an interesting precursor. So that's why we sometimes talk about the Hartford Convention. I wish they talked about a little bit more detail. The Federalist group was really blackballed as looking as that they wanted to return to monarchy. They really didn't. So anyways, a treaty again. What is the result of the treaty again? What's the result of the War of 1812? What do we get? Well, basically, we get the complete suppression of Native American, not complete, but close to complete dissolution of the Native American threat. Really becomes much more de minimis after the War of 1812. What do we get vis-a-vis Great Britain? Nothing. The War of 1812 that lasted till 1815 was basically status pro ante. Basically, you went to the status quo. You went to what the existence was in terms of boundaries beforehand. Canada remained in the power of Great Britain. Our boundaries remained the same. But one thing that didn't was impressment. I guess that's one thing that you can say came out of the war successfully. But the book does a great job here. It really unified the nation as an entity of American solidarity, and we were Americans. I mean, we got that after the Revolutionary War, but there was still this concept that we were kind of British in nature and things like that. But the war was this is the War of 1812 I'm talking about, a rebirth of American identity came about as a result of that. Never before had it been this strong a vision that we were Americans and nothing greater. A nice period of recrimination. We start getting along much better with Great Britain after this period of time. And then John C. Calhoun, who later wants to have a revolution within the country, which is called the Civil War. But prior to that, he worked significantly with Henry Clay. And this was the push of the American system. They wanted to do manufacture in America, create infrastructure in America, create basically high tariffs against foreign goods. And we wanted to become a self-sufficient nation and not get entangled in European affairs. And Henry Clay really had a strong vision for that. Internal improvements, roads, canals, let American goods to market for Americans. And that vision with John C. Calhoun was really a promotion for the longest period of time until further tensions developed later on. The one thing the book doesn't talk about at all, which was a little bit irksome to me, which did help unify the American sort of vision, was the Barbary pirates and basically the war, the Barbary Wars. One of them was after Jefferson's period, but one of them was during. We didn't have a navy, we didn't have much of a military, but any of our sailing merchant ships, so we didn't have a navy. These are sailing merchant ships. Before, we were protected by Great Britain. We're no longer part of Great Britain. The Revolutionary War ended it. Great Britain wasn't afraid to let those northern African countries know that, hey, don't be afraid to go after these American merchant ships. We're not guarded. They're not us anymore. We don't have any stake in them. And so what many countries did would pay basically ransom or bribes to these northern African countries not to basically allow piracy. Jefferson was appalled by that, and Jefferson refused it, so declared war on several of these northern African nations, and to little success because we didn't have enough navy, but it gave us a great deal of pride that we weren't willing to pay ransom and bribery, and we were willing to fight. That helped solidify Jefferson's stake in American society in terms of his view. Very popular position, although the war wasn't very successful. And in fact, it got resolved by starting to pay a lesser amount of bribery in the end. I think the book is very, very good. Otherwise, there's many things that happened during this era. You got to focus on some of the big nugget stuff. War of 1812 is a big one. The Republican Democratic Party really developing as almost the only party in American history during this era. The death of the Federalists, other than John Marshall on the Supreme Court. We don't. There's still some evidence of it in some level, but let's face it: the American identity is not one that endorses aristocratic privilege over the common person. We really do take a great deal of pride, and it's developed during this era of commonality that any person's worthy of everyone else in terms of their ability to participate in civics. Obviously, for then it was white men, but it was the birth, it was the start of it to bring it down to the core of humanity that we all should, so it spreads from there. And later we know that right up to this day in the year 2020, we truly believe in that Jeffersonian democracy. Most of us do. That really, once you reach a certain age, other than that, there really should not be prescription on who gets to participate in civic life. We don't even, sometimes we think, oh, shouldn't you be educated? Shouldn't you have civic knowledge? Most of us come to consensus, that'd be great, but it shouldn't be required because those people are going to be impacted by governmental decisions, so therefore they should have a voice. And the things that still are attention now are more in the periphery. I'm not saying they're not important, but should people who are currently incarcerated and serving a jail sentence for felonies or even misdemeanors, should they be able to participate and vote? Should they be able to run for office? So you can see how broad it's gotten. How broad do we want to go? Some people want to go so broad that we allow non-citizens to vote. I don't think we'll ever get there because, should I be able to go over and vote in the Irish elections, even though I'm not a citizen of Ireland, if I should happen to be over there spending some time? I think most people would probably reject that. But some people think that the age should go lower. Some people think the access to citizenship should be gained easier. So there's all these tensions. But in the broad picture of things, the birth or the origin of this very, very broad participation in civic life happened during Jefferson's era. I'll leave you there. I'm trying not to go too long. Book's pretty decent. I'll put up another little mini quiz for chapter 7. And I'm hopefully going to have the midterm up by Sunday. I'll give you at least a full week to take the midterm. Straightforward stuff, I hope.